This is a tale of two economies. One is a superpower in decline, struck by political paralysis and staring at a default. The other is an emerging power, with a decisive leadership and the world's fastest growing economy. I'm talking about the United States and India. Both countries are major economies, but they exhibit a stark contrast. I'll tell you how. And we are starting with the United States of America. For the first time in their history, the US could default on its debt. The government is running out of cash. The budget is being held hostage by political divisions. I'm talking about the US debt ceiling, and we've discussed this before on the show. The US government is about to hit its borrowing limit. Their only option is to raise the cap, to raise the debt limit. Right now, it's a little over $31 trillion. May sound like a lot of money, but it isn't enough for them. Team Biden wants to increase this limit. The opposition is not on board, and that is why America is close to a debt default. They have an odd system in place. The government cannot just borrow the money it wants. It needs the approval of the Congress, and that involves convincing the Republicans. But they're playing hardball.
So no, I don't think we're in a good place. I know we're not. This ignoring the problem, thinking it's going to go away, he could bumble his way just into a default like he did on the border.
That message was for Joe Biden. The Republicans are supposed to meet the president tomorrow, and he's running out of time. He must strike a deal within 2 weeks, else the U.S. could face international humiliation. For the first time ever, the U.S. could default on its debt. The U.S. Treasury has written a letter to the Congress. What does it say? It says Washington has time till the 1st of June. If the debt ceiling is not raised till the 1st of June, there will be a default. So the risk is real. Wall Street is preparing for the worst-case scenario. Banks, brokers, and traders are making plans. They fear a default will disrupt the market. So they're building cash reserves. They're planning how future payments can be handled, and they're preparing contingency plans. Now, let me underline this. We are talking about the world's largest economy here, the US economy. A few months ago, some of their banks collapsed, and there was a ripple effect across the world. Imagine what would happen if the US government defaults. A new crisis is certain. It's hard to predict how bad it will be, but President Biden is optimistic. He says he can reach a deal.
Look,
their position and where they're
what I've learned a long time ago, and you know as well as I do, it's never as good to characterize a negotiation in the middle of a negotiation. I remain optimistic because I'm a congenital optimist.
Well, we wish him well, but the fact is his government is being held hostage over the budget. Compare this to India. No such crisis here. The economy is doing much better. Inflation is under control. There is no policy paralysis. In fact, the Indian economy is now driving global growth. Let me show you an assessment from Morgan Stanley. It believes India will contribute 16% of the global GDP. 16%. Let me quote from that report, in fact. India's strong growth outlook stands out as the best among large economies, and we forecast it will contribute 16% to global GDP growth over 2023-24. And what's working in India's favor? If you go by the report, it lists a lot of positives. Strong domestic demand and rising services export. The economy has largely recovered from the shock of the pandemic. Again, I have some numbers. GST, or the Goods and Services Tax collection, has increased by 35% from pre-pandemic levels. Services exports have increased by 84% since October 2020. Passenger vehicle sales have also shot up by 131%. Again, this is an improvement from before the pandemic. So India has not just managed to bounce back. The Indian economy is in fact performing better than before. The point we are making is simple. These are times of economic uncertainty. Every day there are reports of job cuts. Not too long ago, there were predictions of recession. At a time like this, while India is driving global growth, the US is adding to global worries because of their domestic politics. Have you heard about India's Look East policy? It was unveiled in the 1990s. The idea was quite simple: to reach out to Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia or the Philippines or Thailand. But now there's a new question facing the Indian establishment. Should India be looking even further east? Where does that take us? To the Pacific. And why are we talking about this now? Because of two events. One, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's upcoming visit to Papua New Guinea. He'll be meeting leaders of 14 Pacific Island nations. And two, because of an apology from Fiji. We'll start with the last one, the apology from Fiji. Fiji's Prime Minister recently apologized to Indo-Fijians. For what? for a coup he organized in 1987. Back then, Fiji had two major ethnic groups, the indigenous Fijians and the Indo-Fijians. Now, the Indo-Fijians trace their ancestry to India and they make a sizable chunk of the population. But in 1987, that changed. The military persecuted the Indo-Fijian community. More than 70,000 of these people were forced to flee the country. Now the Prime Minister says he's sorry.
To err is human, to forgive divine. Today, I, Sitiweni Lima Mandarumbuka, on behalf of those who were with me in 1987, ask for your forgiveness and pray that God will grant you the serenity, the power to forgive us. God bless you all.
As they say, time heals everything. Fiji's relations with India have improved recently. Prime Minister Modi visited the country back in 2014. He also announced multiple projects for Fiji. So why the apology now? Maybe because Pacific countries realize India's potential, which brings us to Prime Minister Modi's Papua New Guinea visit. Historically, this area has not been New Delhi's focus. Why is that? Because India is not a Pacific country. The focus was more on the Indian Ocean. New Delhi has just two resident missions there in the Pacific, one in Papua New Guinea and the other in Fiji. So just two missions in a region with 14 island nations. There was a lot of policy neglect and inertia. I'll give you an example. In 2014, India started a new forum, the Forum for India-Pacific Island Countries. The first summit was held in Fiji in 2014. That's what Prime Minister Modi attended. The second was held in Jaipur in India in 2015. And the third will be happening later this month in Papua New Guinea. Do you see the gap? Two summits in 2 years and then absolutely nothing for 7 years. The obvious question is, what has changed now? Why is the third summit happening now? Because of India's Indo-Pacific policy. You can't be an Indo-Pacific power by limiting yourself to the Indian Ocean. You need a foothold in the Pacific as well. This region makes up 20% of the Earth's surface. It is home to several key trade routes. It could also become a front line in future conflicts. Let's rewind to the Second World War. The US and Japan fought most battles in the Pacific. Plus, we're talking about 14 countries here. Big or small, that's 14 votes at the United Nations. Important. So India's interest is understandable. But that's not why New Delhi is suddenly pivoting to the Pacific. That would be because of China. In the last 2 decades, China has invested heavily in the region. Their end game is this, to replace the US as the major Pacific power. That's what China wants. As always, the West was late to realize. And now they're rushing to make up. President Joe Biden will also be in Papua New Guinea along with Prime Minister Modi. Washington is trying to build an alliance there. In the month of March, Japan announced a plan to invest $75 billion. Now it's India's turn. Reports say multiple deals will be signed. When Prime Minister Modi is there, they'll cover small and medium industries, easing travel restrictions and cultural exchanges. The Pacific Islands are apparently interested in two very specific things: capacity building and disaster management. And India excels at both. Plus, New Delhi brings fresh perspective to the region. No colonial past, no World War hangover. India can be a trusted partner of the Pacific. The conditions are certainly there to force a lasting partnership. Let's see what happens on the 22nd of May. We are counting down to the Cricket World Cup in India. It's just 5 months away. Last time India hosted it, we won the whole thing. So this time, expectations are huge, but so are controversies. Pakistan, for one, is threatening to boycott the tournament. First, listen in to their cricket board chief.
I'm not worried about the Asia Cup. It's the World Cup. And India should not be looking at a situation where we end up boycotting the Asia Cup and also the World Cup. And then India ends up boycotting the Champions Trophy. There'll be a huge mess.
Why is Pakistan threatening a boycott? Because India has refused to play in Pakistan. There's another major tournament scheduled before the World Cup. That's the Asia Cup. It's slated for September and Pakistan is hosting. But the BCCI says India will not go. No prizes for guessing why. Pakistan's security situation is still bad. More than 430 terror attacks were reported until April. Total casualties, more than 850 people dead and injured. So naturally, the BCCI is wary. You see, the men in blue are not just a cricket team for us. They represent a lot more. They're India's global ambassadors. So sending them to Pakistan is a huge risk. When India objected, Pakistan came back with a plan. What if Team India's matches were played elsewhere, perhaps in the UAE? The other teams could still play in Pakistan. Well, no luck so far. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and India have rejected this plan, and each for their own reason. Which brings us to the World Cup in October. Pakistan wants to play tit for tat. They say, if you can't play in Pakistan, we won't play in India. And what is the BCCI saying? No official statement so far, but from the looks of it, they won't budge. Not unless the ICC decides to intervene. That's the International Cricket Council, ICC. Now, what do we make of this Pakistani threat? Are they serious or are they bluffing? Just look at what's happening in their country. Until last week, the BCCI had just one worry, and that was terror attacks. But now there's a full-blown constitutional crisis in Pakistan. You have protests, you have crackdowns, and you have tanks rolling on the streets. Pakistan cannot handle one ex-cricketer. Can they really handle dozens from India? Seems unlikely. The fact is, Pakistan's security situation is not acceptable. Certainly not for Team India to visit. So what's the solution? Maybe the ICC can broker some deal, perhaps convince India to play its matches outside Pakistan, or simply pull the entire tournament from the country. And that's the big worry for Pakistan, really. If they lose hosting rights, they also lose a lot of money. How much money are we talking about? Around $3 million. So Pakistan needs the Asia Cup. They need the revenue more than the actual trophy. It's unfortunate for Pakistani fans, but they should know who to blame. Their own politicians and generals. Time for a short detour. Do you know why Pakistan doesn't host major tournaments anymore? Because of what happened in 2009. The Sri Lankan team was attacked by terrorists. 6 of them were wounded in the attack. It was after 2009 that cricket left Pakistan, and now we are told things are different. That Pakistan is safe again. I can tell you what the stock arguments are. Sri Lanka toured Pakistan in 2019, England toured in 2022, Australia also toured in the same year. But here's a question. Does Pakistan sponsor terror attacks in Australia? Does it claim sovereign English territory? Does it send terrorists to attack Sri Lankan cities? I don't think so. They're capable of it, but they haven't really done it yet. But India has suffered all of it. So the Australian team may feel safe in Pakistan, but an Indian team will not, especially the most powerful and popular team in Indian sport. That's one part of the argument. The second is linking politics and sports. A lot of people will say, don't do it. Don't link politics and sports. But how many of them have a neighbor who uses terror as state policy? I guess none. The last India-Pakistan bilateral was played in 2012-2013. Pakistan came to India back then. The year before that, in 2011, India hosted the World Cup. Team India played Pakistan in the semi-finals. Former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, invited the Pakistani Prime Minister to watch the match. You may remember these pictures. It was called cricket diplomacy. Let's go even further back. To 2003-2004, the Indian team travelled to Pakistan. This was just 4 years after Kargil. It was called a big diplomatic gesture. But what did India get in return on all these occasions? Betrayals and more terror attacks. You see, the idea of linking politics and sports is not some outdated and narrow ideology. It's happened throughout history. And India has a valid reason to do so. Why make money for the Pakistani Cricket Board? Why give lucrative IPL contracts to Pakistani players? And don't get me wrong, this is not about punishing the Pakistani public or their players. This is about putting a squeeze on the top bosses. It's much like how sanctions work. So Pakistan would do well to get its own house in order first. Perhaps figure out how to deal with their raging captain before hosting neighbors. The Spanish have an expression, April will bring the rains. That's the English translation, of course. No matter which language you say it in, though, this year it proved to be wrong. In April this year, there was no rain. In fact, this April was the hottest and driest one on record. This March was Spain's second driest in 100 years. I can go on, but you get the idea. Spain is suffering a drought. Experts are calling it a mega drought. It has come with an unusually early heat wave. The result is this: water shortages, skyrocketing food prices, farmers fighting for their survival. What's worse, now Spain is on the path to becoming a desert. 75% of the country is already in the process of desertification. Here's a report.
Spain is dehydrated. It is running out of water, and this has become the country's biggest crisis. A long list of reasons is behind this. The biggest one is its drought. It was long and painful, a mega drought according to experts. Spain saw an unusually warm winter and a sheer lack of rain. 30 consecutive months recorded below average rain. This was followed by hot months. They consecutively hit record temperatures. And now there's a heat wave which has come earlier than expected. Now combine all these factors. They will lead you to Spain's depleted reservoirs. They are drying up. Some of them are at less than 25% of their capacity.
The summers are getting longer and longer, and of course, evaporation takes its toll, and also there is this strong drought that we are not used to. The fact that it just rained for 2 days in 2023, everything has conspired to create the perfect storm.
A perfect storm indeed. One that is hot, dry, and is drinking up all of its water. This is obviously hurting Spain on multiple levels. The country is called Europe's back garden because it exports a large chunk of what it produces. But now agriculture is taking a hit, so farmers are the first to suffer. Their crops are dying. 60% of their cereal crops have dried out. The cultivation of key crops like olive, almond, and pistachio have also taken a hit. Thousands have lost the means to their daily bread.
Spain is experiencing the most severe drought in recent years after the last one in 1993. 30 years have passed. This time, it is even more severe than the previous one. More than 60% of Spanish farmland is being affected by the drought. There is uncertainty in the farming sector due to the lack of water for irrigation and because of the chaos this is causing, as we don't know if we will be able to save our crops or whether the trees will be able to survive.
The suffering of farmers has also become the country's pain because the prices of food are soaring and people are unable to afford basic things like olive oil.
The price of edible oil has risen significantly. Fruit prices are also climbing. The price hike of all edible oils is very crazy. Overall, all the prices are going up.
As if these problems weren't enough, Spain has a new disaster in the making. It is slowly turning into a desert. 75% of the country is going through desertification. The country's climate is changing and people are struggling to cope. They are protesting. Thousands are holding processions to pray for rain. And the government is scrambling to take action. They have imposed new policies. But at this point, it all feels like too little, too late. For decades, Spain has overexploited its groundwater, 80% of which is attributed to farming. It didn't take enough measures to curb the damage. And now, climate change has made everything worse. They urgently need to adapt to this new arid climate and rethink how they use water. If they want to act, the time is now, because the desert sands of time are slipping through their hands.
To Germany now. Berlin is quite annoyed with Beijing. Why? Because of China's secret police stations. They're still operational, though China says they're not. It said it shut down such facilities in February. Also, China doesn't call them secret police stations, it calls them service stations. Either way, it assured Germany that such stations had been closed. So Germany decided to check, and it found that China was lying. The Interior Ministry spokesperson has issued a statement. Let me quote from what has been said. The security authorities continue to assume that there are 2 so-called overseas police stations in Germany. How do you think China responded to this? With another denial. The Chinese embassy in Berlin has issued a statement. You can see the translation on your screen. Let me give you the highlights of this. These volunteers are simply dedicated overseas Chinese, not Chinese police officers. There are also no so-called police stations or overseas police service centers. These voluntary offers of support have been discontinued. We can expect that the German side will deal with this objectively and leave no room for further speculation. There were also the usual declarations of China respecting international law and sovereignty. Now, China would have you believe that all of this is harmless, that these stations have no sinister agenda. They're just outposts to help Chinese citizens abroad, but no one's taking their word for it. The world sees these stations for what they really are, centers to intimidate Chinese dissidents. They're set up in areas with a sizable Chinese diaspora, and they act like Beijing's dirty work departments. They perform tasks that are too shady for diplomats, like tracking down dissidents, intimidating them to go back to China. And there are many such people all over the world. Those who opposed the communist regime and had to flee China. Those who had politically motivated cases against them. Those who face arrest on trumped-up charges in China. Such people try to make a life for themselves in other countries. Many of them leave their families behind in China, and that becomes their weakness that Beijing exploits. They force dissidents to return, and they threaten harm to their families. And it's all done through these secret police stations. China runs them all over the world, hundreds of them. The first reports about these came out last year. Many countries woke up to this fact. They decided to take action. Last October, a German spokesperson made a bold declaration. I'm quoting again. The federal government does not tolerate the exercise of foreign state authority, and accordingly, Chinese authorities have no executive powers on the territory of the Federal Republic of Germany. It's been more than 6 months since, but China's secret police stations are still around. How? They've apparently gone mobile. Yesterday, a spokesperson said that the stations are, quote-unquote, usually not fixed stationary offices, but mobile facilities. So basically, Chinese intimidators on wheels. How lovely. This adaptability is why countries are struggling to shut these stations down. When under the scanner, the secret Chinese police stations just up and move. And according to the US, they also purge their data. Last month, we told you about 2 arrests. 2 Chinese secret police officials were arrested in the US. On what charges? Obstructing justice by destroying evidence of their communications. Basically, erasing the data. You see how it can be difficult to dismantle the insidious Chinese operation. Yesterday, Germany publicly rebuked China, and as usual, China denied any wrongdoing. Until countries find a way to tighten the screws, Beijing will keep on meddling in their territory. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Sudan. A fire broke out in the city of Omdurman. This is where intense battles have been fought between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary troops. In Italy's Pompeii, 2 more victims of a 2,000-year-old volcanic eruption have been found. In Peru, an anemic, malnourished and hypothermic sloth has been rescued. And finally, taking you back in history, what makes the 16th of May significant? On this day, the so-called Cultural Revolution was launched in China by communist leader Mao Zedong. The year was 1966. Mao wanted to assert, his authority over the Chinese government and the people. He felt that China was headed in the wrong direction. He wanted the so-called impure elements of the society to be purged. In the months and years that followed, elderly and intellectual people were attacked and harassed. Millions of people, were killed. Many were tortured and imprisoned. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Aveva la protezione, quella cosa tonda.
email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.